It is no secret that a lot of video game writing is absolute dog crap. It feels like the developers hired a roomful of monkeys with typewriters and just hoped for the best. I put together a list of games that have writing that is actually competent and will keep you interested without making you roll your eyes into the back of your head. Let's check it out. Detroit Become Human, this game is actually a banger. It is arguably the best interactive drama ever made, and for once, the Choices Matter tag isn't just a marketing lie to get you to buy the game. The story is, the premise is pretty standard sci-fi stuff. You are in the near future, androids are everywhere, and they are basically treated like modern-day slaves. They clean toilets, take care of kids, and do all the shit humans don't want to do. Naturally, they start waking up and realizing that being a slave is terrible. You play as 3 different androids, and their stories are completely distinct but weave together in a way that actually makes sense. First, you have Connor. He is an android cop sent to hunt down other androids that have gone rogue. This is easily the best part of the game. It is a buddy cop movie where you are partnered with this washed-up, alcoholic human detective named Hank. The dynamic here is god tier. You can choose to be a cold, calculating machine that only cares about the mission, or you can try to be empathetic and actually make friends with the guy. Then there's Marcus. He is the one leading the revolution. His sections are grand and high stakes. You are basically deciding if the android uprising is going to be a peaceful protest or a violent bloodbath. The game lets you go full pacifist or full anarchist, and the public opinion in the game world actually shifts based on what you do. Finally, you have Kara. Her story is much more personal and smaller in scale. She is just trying to protect a little girl and escape to safety. It is the emotional core of the game, and if you have a heart, some of these scenes will actually stress you out because the threat of permadeath is real. Now for the mechanics and gameplay. This is a movie game, so do not go in expecting to be 360 no-scoping people. The gameplay is mostly walking around, talking to people, and hitting buttons during QuickTime events. But the implementation is actually solid. The investigation scenes with Connor are a highlight. You walk into a crime scene, analyze blood samples, reconstruct bullet trajectories, and piece together what happened. It feels rewarding because if you screw up the investigation, you might miss a crucial clue that unlocks a dialogue option later. The biggest mechanical flex in this game is the flowchart. At the end of every chapter, the game literally shows you a massive tree of all the possible outcomes. You can see exactly where the story branched and realize you missed like 3 entire scenes because you decided to look at a magazine instead of talking to a suspect. It is insane how much content is hidden behind specific choices. You could play this game 3 times and get completely different endings for every character. The graphics are honestly some of the most impressive stuff you will see on a console or PC. Quantic Dream spent an obscene amount of money on motion capture, and it shows. The faces don't look like melted plastic. You can actually read the emotions on the characters without them saying a word. The environment design in Detroit is also top tier. It nails that near-future aesthetic where everything looks sleek but also kind of miserable and cold. It is a very good-looking game, plain and simple. If you want a game that respects your time and your intelligence, play this. It's not perfect, and there are definitely some moments where the allegory for civil rights is about as subtle as a brick to the face. But the characters are memorable, the tension is real, and the fact that you can permanently kill off your main characters by making a bad call adds a layer of stress that most games are too cowardly to attempt. It's a solid experience from start to finish.
Follow me. I'll take you to your room.
Okay, now what?
Mafia Definitive Edition is one of a few remakes in existence that actually justifies its own existence. Usually when a studio decides to modernize a classic, they strip out everything that made the original good and replace it with microtransactions and soulless grinding. But Hangar 13 actually cooked with this one. They took a janky 2002 game that was impossible to play without breaking a controller and turned it into a legitimate mob movie that you control. The story is that you play as Tommy Angelo. He is a cab driver in the 1930s, which is already a depressing job, but then he gets forced into the mob because he happened to look at a gangster the wrong way. The narrative here is arguably better than most actual mob movies. It is not just go here, shoot this guy, collect money. It is a genuine tragedy about loyalty and how being a criminal is actually extremely stressful. The characters are fantastic. You have Polly and Sam, your 2 best friends, who are absolute psychopaths, but in a charming way. And then there is the ending. I'm not gonna spoil it, but it is one of those endings that will leave you staring at your monitor in silence for 5 minutes, just processing the absolute gut punch you just took. As for the gameplay, the shooting is standard third-person cover stuff. You hide behind a crate, you pop out, you shoot a guy at a fedora, you repeat. It is satisfying enough. The guns sound punchy and the enemies react dramatically when you blast them with a shotgun. But the driving, oh my god, the driving. These cars handle like boats filled with lead. It is historically accurate, sure, but taking a corner at 30 miles per hour feels like you're trying to drift an aircraft carrier. And we have to talk about the race mission, the fair play mission. Whoever designed this level has a special place reserved in hell. You have to drive this cigar-shaped death trap around a track that has zero grip, and the AI drivers are actively trying to murder you. In the original game, this mission made grown men cry. In the remake, it is still hard enough to make you consider throwing your controller through your monitor. But beating it feels like conquering a mountain, so there's that. Also, the city of Lost Heaven is ridiculously good looking. It's honestly offensive how good the lighting is. Driving through the city at night with the rain slicking up the roads and the neon signs reflecting off the puddles is a whole vibe. The facial animations are also top tier. You can see every wrinkle, every pore, and every subtle expression of, I'm definitely going to get whacked on Tommy's face. It adds so much weight to the cutscenes because the characters don't look like dead-eyed mannequins. This game does not waste your time. There is no bloat, there are no stupid side quests where you have to collect 100 hidden cigars for an achievement nobody cares about. It is a straight shot of adrenaline and depression. It is a tight, focused 10-hour experience that tells a complete story without dragging it out. If you want a game that feels like playing through Goodfellas but with more frustrating driving physics, this is the one.
Get him off me!
Plague Tale: Innocence. This game is basically a simulator for having the absolute worst week of your life. If you looked at The Last of Us and thought it was too cheerful and needed about 5,000% more rats, then this is the game for you. It is a stealth game set in medieval France during the Black Death, which is already a setting that screams depression, but then they added supernatural rat swarms just to really drive the point home that God has abandoned this world. It is stressful, it is gross, and it is weirdly heartwarming in a twisted way. You play as Amicia, a teenage girl who has to take care of her little brother, Hugo. Hugo has some weird magic blood disease called the macula, and because of this, the Inquisition wants to capture him. The Inquisition in this game makes the Empire from Star Wars look like a charity organization. They are comically evil and will murder anything that moves. The entire story is just you dragging this little kid through mud, corpses, and battlefields while trying not to get eaten alive. The relationship between the siblings is the whole point. At the start, they barely know each other because Hugo has been locked in a room his whole life. But by the end, you will genuinely care about this little dude. It is essentially an escort mission that lasts the entire game, which usually sounds like a nightmare, but Hugo is actually written well enough that you don't want to throw him into a pit of rats most of the time. Now for the gameplay. It is pure stealth and puzzle solving. You are a teenage girl with a sling. You are not Kratos. You cannot fight a guy in full plate armor with your bare hands. If a guard gets within grabbing distance, you are dead. The combat is all about keeping your distance and using your brain. You use your sling to break lanterns to unleash the rats on guards, or you hit them in the head with a rock to knock them out. It is extremely satisfying to hear that dink sound when a rock connects with a helmet. The rats are the main mechanic. They are terrified of light, so the game becomes this deadly puzzle where you have to manipulate light sources to create a path through a sea of biting death. If you step into the shadows for 1 second, you are stripped to the bone instantly. It creates this constant tension where you are safe in the light, but the light is always fading or moving. It is simpler than something like Metal Gear, but the stakes feel higher because you are so powerless. Talking about the graphics, the technology they built for the rats is actually insane. There could be up to 5,000 rats on screen at once, and they move like a fluid. They pour out of vents and walls like a tidal wave of fur and teeth. It is technically impressive and absolutely revolting at the same time. The environments are grim but beautiful in a macabre way. You walk through battlefields piled high with bodies, quaint French villages that are being destroyed by the plague, and dark, damp crypts. The lighting engine does a lot of heavy lifting here since light is a mechanic, and the contrast between the warm safety of a torch and the writhing darkness of the rats looks fantastic. This is a focused, linear story that knows exactly what it wants to be. It is about 10 to 12 hours long, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. It is not a happy game. You will see things that will make you lose your appetite, but the narrative payoff is worth the misery. Dispatch is the perfect example of what happens when you focus on the writing instead of trying to render every individual pore on a character's face. You play as Robert Robertson, a washed-up superhero working a desk job is already a massive win. The premise is genius because it flips the entire superhero genre on its head. Instead of being the guy flying around punching aliens, you are the guy in the chair. You are the one dealing with the logistics, the budget cuts, and the absolute incompetence of the heroes you are supposed to be managing. It is stressful in a way that feels very real. You aren't losing because you missed a quick-time event, you are losing because you sent the wrong C-list hero to stop a bank robbery and now civilians are dead and your boss is screaming at you. The writing is sharp, cynical, and legitimately funny. It feels like The Boys, but with more focus on the mundane nightmare of corporate bureaucracy. And the tension comes from the fact that you are helpless. You can't jump in and save the day, you have to trust that the idiot you sent can handle the job. The core loop is managing a live map of the city. Crimes and incidents pop up in real time, bank robberies, cat stuck in a tree, alien invasions, and you have a roster of heroes to send out. But here's the catch. You don't just click send hero, you have to actually analyze the situation. Each hero has stats, strength, vigor, charisma, intellect, combat power, and mental stability. If you send a tank character like Golem to a hostage negotiation, he's going to punch a hole in the building and get the hostages killed. You have to match the right hero to the right job, but the game constantly throws curveballs. Your best hero might be unavailable because they're doing a podcast interview or recovering from a hangover. You are constantly forced to make do with the B team, which creates this insane tension. Then there are also some little simple but fun and satisfying hacking puzzles in the game that add a bit more variety to the gameplay. They aren't overly complex or anything, but hacking something might give your hero some more power or an advantage in specific situations, and sometimes they're just a part of the story. Visually, it keeps things simple with a stylized comic book aesthetic that looks clean and runs smoothly. It proves that you don't need a massive budget to make a game that people will actually remember. It's just a damn good time that reminds you why we play games in the first place, to experience a good story, not to grind for digital currency.
What is it?
I'm not quite drunk enough to share my origin story just yet, but remind me to tell you someday.
Definitely.
Goodnight Universe is one of those games that comes out of nowhere and quietly messes you up if you give it the time. No flashy bullshit, just a weird little story game that knows exactly what it wants to do and does it without begging for attention. It's made by the same people who did Before Your Eyes, and yeah, you can feel that DNA all over it. This is another game that's way more interested in feelings and perspective than mechanics. You play as a baby, not in a goofy joke way, but in a very deliberate, kind of uncomfortable way. You're stuck in a crib, you can't move much, you can't talk, and the world just happens around you. The twist is that this baby has psychic powers, which sounds silly on paper, but the game plays it straight. You can influence objects, mess with the environment, and slowly realize you're not just some passive observer. You're aware, too aware. The gameplay is minimal. You look around, focus on things, and use your powers in small ways. That's basically it. There's no combat, no fail states, no skill trees pretending this is deeper than it is. The interaction is intentionally limited because the whole point is how powerless you are. You're seeing adult problems, adult arguments, adult fears, all from the position of someone who can't explain themselves. That limitation is where the game gets its weight. The story slowly builds through moments that feel very normal at first. Family conversations, background noise, parents talking about stuff they think you don't understand. And then it starts to go places. The psychic element becomes more important. What Goodnight Universe does really well is perspective. You're constantly reminded that you're small, stuck, and dependent. The camera angle, the sound design, the way voices fade in and out, all of it reinforces that. It feels intimate in a way most games don't even try to be. The writing is simple but sharp. Nobody talks like they're delivering a monologue. It sounds like real conversations you've overheard 100 times. There are downsides. It's short, like really short. If you're looking for something meaty to sink hours into, this is not that. The gameplay is barely gameplay, and if story games already test your patience, this will not convert you. Some people will bounce off it hard and call it boring, and honestly, I get it. But if you're into story-driven games that experiment with perspective and emotion instead of mechanics, this one sticks. Goodnight Universe is small, strange, and very intentional. It's not trying to be for everyone, and that's why it works. As a story experience, it earns its spot. It's the kind of game you finish in one sitting and then think about later while doing something completely unrelated, which is usually the sign it did its job.
What was that?
But no. Were they mocking me?
Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 doubles down on being grounded, historical, and straight-up hostile if you show up expecting a power fantasy. You play Henry again, and the story continues right where the first game left off. Nobody magically forgets who you are. The world stays medieval Bohemia, which means it's filthy, unfair, and completely uninterested in making you feel important. Henry isn't a chosen hero or some legendary warrior. He's a guy shaped by trauma, loyalty, and a long list of bad calls, trying to survive in a world that doesn't give a shit about him. The writing leans harder into politics, class tension, and how ugly medieval life actually was. Lords exploit people, wars are chaotic, justice depends on who you know. It all feels unpleasant on purpose. Gameplay is where the biggest improvement lands. Sword fighting feels like learning timing, spacing, and stamina instead of fighting the controller. Swing like a maniac and you die. Panic and you die. Try to fight 3 people at once and you die immediately. When you win, it feels earned because the game never tries to make it look cool. Progress comes from what you actually do. You want to read better? You read. You want to fight better? You train and get your ass kicked until you improve. The game never hands you growth for free. Even basic things like talking to nobles, sneaking around, or surviving in the wilderness require prep. Armor matters, hygiene matters, reputation matters. People react to how you look and behave, and that small detail changes how the whole world treats you. The world feels genuinely lived in. Towns are packed, dirty, and loud. NPCs work, sleep, argue, and gossip whether you're there or not. You overhear conversations that have nothing to do with you. Roads feel dangerous. Forests feel empty and threatening instead of being pretty background noise. Walking from one town to another feels like an actual journey instead of filler. The pacing stays slow and demands patience. You spend a lot of time talking, investigating, and setting things up before anything big happens. When those moments hit, they hit because the game took its time earning them. Characters avoid flashy archetypes. They feel human, selfish, and limited by their situation. Alliances feel unstable. Trust never feels permanent. It still has problems. The game stays unforgiving. Systems can overwhelm new players. Saving stays limited and annoying. Bugs are better than the first game, but they haven't vanished. If you hated the first game's obsession with realism, this one won't change your mind. As a story-driven RPG, though, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is special. It treats history seriously, respects your intelligence, and refuses to soften its world for comfort. It's slow, harsh, and deeply immersive. If you want a medieval story that feels human, dirty, and earned instead of heroic and clean, this game belongs on the list.
It seems you're out of luck.
There's just one man who gives a fuck.
A friend who'll never leave you stuck. Now who can that friend be?
Well,
Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater Remake is Kojima at full power before the series went completely unhinged in a way that scares normal people. The story is set during the Cold War, way before the rest of the series, and that's part of why it works so well. You don't need a Metal Gear PhD to get into it. You play as Naked Snake before he became the legend everyone talks about. He's not a walking myth yet. He's skilled, sure, but he's still human, still learning, still getting emotionally wrecked by the people around him. The story focuses heavily on loyalty, ideology, and what happens when duty starts conflicting with basic human feelings. It takes itself seriously, but not in a boring way. What makes Snake Eater special story-wise is that it's surprisingly personal. This isn't about saving the world every 5 minutes. It's about relationships, trust, and betrayal in a political system that chews people up and throws them away. The villains aren't just evil for the sake of it. They all have weird philosophies, strange honor codes, and motivations that make sense within this world. Even when things get ridiculous, and they do, there's always an emotional core holding it together. Gameplay-wise, this was the game that shifted Metal Gear from clean indoor stealth to survival. You're dropped into jungles instead of hallways. You have to manage stamina, injuries, and camouflage. You're eating whatever you can find, patching yourself up, and adapting to the environment. It sounds simple now, but at the time it was wild. The remake keeps all of that intact, just modernized so it doesn't feel like you're fighting the controls from 2004. Stealth is still the heart of the game. You're encouraged to observe, plan, and move carefully. Charging in guns blazing is possible, but it's almost always a terrible idea. The game rewards patience and creativity. You can mess with enemies, avoid fights entirely, or handle situations in weird ways that feel very Metal Gear. It constantly gives you options without spelling them out. The tone is also a big reason this game sticks. It balances serious Cold War spy drama with moments of pure insanity. 1 minute it's talking about nuclear deterrence and ideological warfare, and the next it's doing something completely unhinged with a straight face. Somehow it works. The remake keeps that tone intact instead of sanding it down into something safe and boring. The writing and characters are the real reason this game is legendary. Dialogue is memorable without being try-hard. Characters stick with you because they feel larger than life, but still human. The game loves long conversations, and instead of feeling like filler, they actually build tension and meaning. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater is one of those rare story games that still holds up decades later, and the remake just gives it a fresh coat of paint without breaking what made it special. It's smart, weird, emotional, and confident in a way modern games are often scared to be. The Walking Dead Telltale series came out at a time when story games were not taken seriously at all. Back then, most people thought games needed shooting, skill trees, and big maps to matter. Telltale basically ignored all of that and said the story itself is the game. That was the risky part, and somehow it worked. The series ended up changing how people looked at story-driven games. The first season puts you in the shoes of Lee Everett, a man with a past who ends up in the middle of a zombie outbreak. Zombies are there, sure, but they are not the real threat. The real danger is people. Fear, hunger, panic, and selfish choices drive almost every bad thing that happens. Gameplay is extremely simple, and that is very much on purpose. You walk around small areas, look at objects, and talk to people. The most important mechanic is dialogue choices. You are often given only a few seconds to respond, which creates pressure. You do not get time to think things through like a strategy game. You answer how you feel in that moment, and the game locks it in. That alone makes the choices feel heavier. There is also the famous "this character will remember that" system. It does not mean the game branches into 100 different endings. What it really does is change how characters treat you, trust you, or blame you later. Some characters remember your kindness, others remember when you hesitated or stayed silent. Silence itself is a choice in this game, and sometimes it is the worst one. What makes The Walking Dead special is how grounded it feels. The writing is not fancy. People talk like people. They interrupt each other, get angry fast, say the wrong thing, and regret it later. Combat exists, but it is basic and clunky by design. You mash buttons, aim slow, and mess up under pressure. This is not power fantasy combat. It's meant to feel messy and stressful. Sometimes the controls fight you, and while that can be frustrating, it also fits the tone. Survival here never feels clean or cool. The presentation also matters. The comic book art style helped the game age better than realistic graphics would have. The rough lines and muted colors fit the bleak world. If story matters to you at all, this series earns its place. It's not about winning, it's about living with the choices you made, even when none of them feel good, and that's exactly why it's stuck with so many people. Life is Strange. This game is a straight-up masterpiece of atmospheric storytelling. It's rare to find a game that captures a specific mood so perfectly that you actually feel like you are living in its world. Don't Nod Entertainment created something special here. It takes the nostalgia of being a teenager, mixes it with a gritty murder mystery, and sprinkles in some sci-fi elements that somehow make the emotional beats hit even harder. It is an experience that stays with you long after the credits roll because it prioritizes character depth over everything else. You play as Max Caulfield, a photography student who discovers she can rewind time. She uses this power to reconnect with her childhood best friend, Chloe Price. The relationship between Max and Chloe is the heart of the entire game. It is arguably one of the most well-developed duos in gaming history. You watch them rebuild their friendship while trying to solve the disappearance of another student, Rachel Amber. The writing does an incredible job of balancing the supernatural stuff with real human drama, see coming, leading up to a finale that is absolutely heartbreaking. Also, the mechanics. The gameplay loops are unique because of the rewind mechanic. In most narrative games, you make a choice and you're stuck with it. Here, you can test out different outcomes, see how people react, and then decide what path you want to take. It turns the standard Telltale formula on its head. The game also plays with the concept of the butterfly effect constantly. Small decisions you make in the first episode ripple out and cause massive changes in the story by the end. The puzzles are clever without being annoying, usually involving using your time powers to get into places you shouldn't be or to get information out of people. It feels that you are actually investigating a mystery rather than just clicking through dialogue trees. The art style is beautiful. It uses a hand-painted aesthetic that looks like a moving watercolor painting. It gives the whole game a dreamlike, soft quality that fits the nostalgic vibe perfectly. The golden hour lighting in Arcadia Bay is iconic. The developers knew exactly how to use color and light to set the mood. The soundtrack deserves a special mention too. The indie folk music matches the visuals perfectly. Walking down the school hallway with your headphones on while the music swells is a vibe that very few games have ever managed to replicate. It creates an immersion that is hard to break. Life is Strange is a must-play if you care about narrative in video games. It proves that you don't need photorealistic graphics or explosive action to make a game that people will talk about for a decade. It is a raw, emotional journey that makes you care deeply about its characters. It's just a fantastic piece of art.
Bro.
What the hell? Are you kidding?
Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of those games where you boot it up and immediately realize Rockstar does not give a single f about your time. Everything is slow. Animations are slow, riding your horse is slow, looting a drawer takes long enough that you start thinking about life choices, and somehow that slowness is the entire point. You play as Arthur Morgan, who at first looks like the standard big tough outlaw guy. Big beard, big guns, big attitude, but the game slowly peels that back and shows you a guy who is tired, confused, and stuck in a dying lifestyle. This is set at the end of the Wild West, when outlaws are basically dinosaurs waiting for extinction. Law is everywhere, civilization is closing in, and the Vanderland gang is falling apart because their leader is full of shit and refuses to accept reality. The story takes its time, sometimes too much time. The opening hours are brutally slow and honestly test your patience. Snowy mountains, long rides, endless talking. But once the world opens up, the game starts doing something very few games manage. It lets characters exist. People talk without rushing to the next plot point. Camp conversations feel natural. You hear arguments, jokes, quiet moments, and slow mental breakdowns happening in real time. Gameplay-wise, this is not a tight shooter. Guns feel heavy and kinda clunky, movement is stiff, missions are insanely restrictive. Step 2 feet out of the invisible box Rockstar wants you in, and the game slaps you with a mission failed screen like you committed a war crime. That part is frustrating as hell, especially in a game with such a massive open world. But outside of missions, the world absolutely destroys almost every other open world game. NPCs feel real, towns have routines, people remember you. Random events do not feel random, they feel placed with intent. You help someone on the road and see them later. You mess with the wrong people and it comes back to bite you hours later. Animals behave like animals, not walking XP bags. The world just keeps moving, whether you care or not. Arthur himself carries the entire experience. The writing and voice acting are stupidly good. He feels like an actual person, not a video game avatar. The honor system is not some dumb meter for good boy points. It shapes how Arthur talks, how he sees himself, and how his story ends. The game never screams at you about morality. It just quietly reacts to the kind of person you decide to be. Look, at this point, talking about The Witcher 3 is like saying Oxygen is pretty cool. It is universally agreed upon that this game is the gold standard for open-world RPGs. And for once, the internet hive mind is actually correct. This game came out in 2015, and it still embarrasses billion-dollar studios releasing games today that look like potato salad compared to this masterpiece. CD Projekt Red somehow managed to create a world that is so depressing and miserable that you actually want to live in it, which is a weird accomplishment. You play as Geralt of Rivia, who is basically a mutant monster exterminator with the emotional range of a brick wall, but that is exactly why he works so well as a protagonist. He is just a tired dad trying to find his adopted daughter, while everyone around him is either trying to scam him, kill him, or play cards with him. The story is the main reason people lose hundreds of hours of their life to this game. Most RPGs give you fetch quests that are absolute brain rot, like go collect 10 bear asses for 5 gold coins. In The Witcher 3, you take a contract to kill a ghost in a well, and 3 hours later, you are unraveling a tragic murder mystery involving a jealous lover and a village conspiracy. The Bloody Baron questline is the perfect example of this. It starts as a simple information trade and spirals into this brutally dark story about domestic abuse, alcoholism, and guilt that leaves you staring at your screen wondering if you made the right choice. There are no good guys, just people trying to survive in a world that actively hates them. It is grim, it is grounded, and it makes every other fantasy story feel like a fairy tale for toddlers. Mechanically, the combat is the only part where people get divisive. It is not Devil May Cry. You are not going to be doing air combos. It's a lot of dodging, rolling, and casting Quen because you are terrified of getting hit. You basically dance around enemies like a ballerina with 2 swords. But the preparation aspect is where the gameplay actually shines. You don't just run up to a griffin and hit it with a stick. You have to read the bestiary, brew the right oils for your blade, drink potions that raise your toxicity levels until Geralt looks like a crack addict, and equip the right bombs. It makes you feel like an actual professional monster slayer who does his homework rather than a generic chosen one. Visually, the game still looks insane. The art direction in Valen nails that wet, muddy, war-torn hellhole vibe perfectly. The trees bend in the wind, the sunsets are ridiculous, and the cities like Novigrad feel like actual functioning places with thousands of people living their lives. It doesn't feel like a video game map populated by NPCs waiting for you to walk by. It feels like a real world that doesn't care if you exist or not. This game is the benchmark. If you haven't played it, you are denying yourself one of the best pieces of media ever made. It is long, it is dense, and it is absolutely worth every second. Uncharted 4 acts like the final exam for every action-adventure game that came before it, and it passes with a score that makes everyone else look illiterate. You are jumping into the shoes of Nathan Drake one last time, but instead of immediately throwing you into a war zone, the game takes its sweet time showing you a version of a character that is washed up and trying to live a normal domestic life. It is a bold choice to make you sit through the mundane reality of his retirement because it perfectly sets up why he would eventually lie to his wife and drag his ass back into danger the second his brother shows up with a sob story. The narrative weight here is heavy, dealing with obsession and the fact that chasing adrenaline usually leaves your personal life in shambles, and it handles these themes with a maturity that you almost never see in a genre usually reserved for mindless explosions. The visual presentation is just stupidly good, and you don't even need to look for the small details to realize that this is one of the best looking things ever put on a screen. Every environment you move through, from the muddy jungles to the crumbling ruins, feels handcrafted and dense, creating an atmosphere that is so immersive it is actually hard to look away. The transition from cutscene to gameplay is so seamless that half the time you don't even realize you are back in control until you are getting shot at, which keeps the pacing moving at a speed that never really drags despite the game being fairly long for a linear story. It is the kind of polish that ruins other games for you, because you start noticing how janky everything else is by comparison. Gameplay-wise, it takes these standard cover shooter mechanics and injects them with a dose of speed and verticality that completely changes the rhythm of the fights. The grappling hook is the MVP here, allowing you to launch yourself across arenas and drop down on enemies, which turned what used to be a static shooting gallery into a high-speed playground of violence. You have the option to approach encounters with stealth, thinning out the herd quietly before things inevitably go loud, and the game feels designed to let you improvise when your plan falls apart. The climbing sections are still just holding a direction and watching an animation play out, but the sense of scale and the fluidity of the movement make it feel satisfying rather than tedious. The writing is the glue that holds the whole package together, delivering dialogue that sounds like actual human beings talking to each other rather than script-reading robots. The banter between Nate and his brother Sam feels natural and lived in, carrying a history that explains their reckless behavior without needing a ton of exposition dumps. It wraps up a decade-long franchise with an ending that feels earned and respectful to the characters, avoiding the trap of trying to do too much just for shock value. It is a masterpiece of pacing and presentation that stands as the definitive example of how to end a series without embarrassing yourself.
Oh, crap, crap, crap! Coming through!
The Wolf Among Us. This game takes the concept of childhood fairy tales and drags them through the gutter of 1980s New York City in a way that feels surprisingly grounded and depressing. You have this hidden community called Fabletown, where characters like Snow White, Beauty and the Beast, and the Woodsman are living in these cramped, run-down apartments, trying to blend in with regular humans, or Mundies, and it is just a miserable existence for most of them. The lore explains that they were chased out of their homelands by a mysterious tyrant, so now they are refugees forced to buy expensive magic called glamour to look human, and if they can't afford it, they get shipped off to the farm in upstate New York, which sounds like a nice retirement home, but is treated like a prison sentence that nobody wants. It creates this immediate class divide where the rich fables live in luxury while the others are selling their furniture just to look normal enough to walk down the street to buy cigarettes. You are stepping into the shoes of Big B Wolf, the actual big bad wolf, who is now the sheriff of this dysfunction, and the writing does a great job of making you feel the weight of his past on your shoulders constantly. Everyone in town is terrified of you because you used to eat their grandmothers or blow their houses down, so even when you are trying to help, they look at you like you are a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. It is a really interesting dynamic where you are the law, but you are also the monster, and the story leans heavily into that internal conflict without being too preachy about it. You are investigating a murder right from the start, and it is not some clean CSI-style procedure, but a messy, violent spiral into the corruption of Fabletown where you have to interrogate people who already hate your guts. The narrative itself plays out like a classic noir film where it is always raining, everyone is smoking, and nobody is telling the truth, but it swaps the usual mobsters for trolls and woodsmen. It works because it takes these characters you know and twists them into these tragic, broken versions of themselves, like one of the three little pigs crashing on your couch and mooching off you because he has nowhere else to go. The story doesn't shy away from the brutality of this world, showing you exactly how desperate these creatures are to survive in a world that doesn't care about them, and it manages to keep you hooked on the investigation because every clue feels like it is peeling back another layer of filth. Licensed superhero games usually fall into two categories. Either they're absolute hot garbage cash grabs, or they're decent for 5 hours and then you forget they exist. This one somehow dodged both and actually stuck the landing. What really makes it work is Peter Parker himself. This is not edgy, angry Spider-Man, and it's not quit machine cartoon Spider-Man either. He's older, broke, tired, juggling too much shit and constantly trying to do the right thing while everything keeps collapsing anyway. He feels overwhelmed in a very real way. Rent, work, relationships, responsibility, all of it piling up at once. The game actually treats that like the core of the story instead of background flavor. The tone is way more grounded than people expect. Yeah, it's still comic book stuff, but the writing keeps things human. The emotional moments don't come out of nowhere, and they don't feel forced. The game takes its time setting things up, so when stuff goes wrong, it actually hits instead of feeling like another cutscene you forget 5 minutes later. Gameplay-wise, this is one of those rare cases where just moving around feels good enough to carry the entire experience. Swinging through the city never really gets old, and that's insane considering how long the game is. You're not fighting the controls or babysitting systems. You're just flowing through the world, reacting to stuff as it happens. Combat is flashy and fun without being deep in a sweaty way. You feel powerful but not invincible, which fits Spider-Man way better than turning him into some unstoppable god. The world itself feels busy and alive without being exhausting. There's always something happening, but the game doesn't scream at you to do everything. You can just exist in the city for a while, and it feels right. Side content varies in quality, some of it is great, some of it is pure filler, but it never completely derails the experience. You're never too far from something interesting happening. What really surprised people was how hard the story goes emotionally. This isn't just a superhero power fantasy, it leans into consequences. People get hurt, mistakes matter. Being Spider-Man comes with a cost, and the game doesn't shy away from showing that. It respects the character enough to let things get uncomfortable instead of wrapping everything in a feel-good bow. Now, yeah, it's not perfect. Open world repetition is still there, some side activities feel like busy work, certain story beats are predictable if you know Spider-Man at all, but none of that really drags the game down because the core experience is so solid.
Keeps up, bystanders will get shot. I gotta get in close. Hey guys, room for one more? Here's your stuff.
This thing doesn't try to be charming, it doesn't try to be fun in a traditional sense, it just sits there, dead serious, and drags you through a broken world like, yeah, this is what the end looks like, deal with it. The setup is stupidly simple, and that's why it works. The world ends, people survive, everything sucks. No prophecy, no epic save-the-world nonsense. You play as Joel, who's basically a walking emotional brick. He's not cool, he's not inspiring, and he's definitely not here to teach you life lessons. He's just a guy who's been hollowed out by loss and learned how to keep going anyway. The game lets him be unpleasant, quiet, and selfish without trying to clean him up for the audience, which already puts it above a ton of other games that are terrified of making their main character anything but lovable. What makes the story hit is how little it begs for your attention. It doesn't scream at you to feel sad, it doesn't drown you in monologues about hope or humanity. Most of the time it's just awkward conversations, long silences, and people saying the wrong thing because they don't know how to talk anymore. The emotional weight sneaks in through the cracks instead of kicking the door down, and that's why it sticks. The zombies are almost background noise. They exist, they're dangerous, but they're not the main attraction. The real focus is people and how absolutely messed up they get when the rules of normal life evaporate. Violence isn't fun or stylish here. Every encounter feels tense, ugly, and a little exhausting. You're not a badass action hero. You're some guy scraping by, hoping nothing goes wrong, and usually something goes wrong. Gameplay matches that energy perfectly. You're slow, resources are limited, and every decision feels slightly uncomfortable. There's no power fantasy. You're always one mistake away from things falling apart. It keeps you on edge without turning into a gimmick, which is harder than it sounds. The world itself feels quietly dead. Empty spaces, empty cities, little environmental details that tell stories without shoving them in your face. The game trusts you to notice things instead of spoon-feeding every emotion, which is rare and honestly kind of refreshing. The reason The Last of Us Part 1 still gets talked about isn't because it's flashy or clever, it's because it commits. It never breaks tone, never undercuts itself with jokes, and never tries to soften the experience to make it more palatable. It knows exactly what it wants to be and sticks to it, even when that means being uncomfortable or slow.
Run!
Ghost of Tsushima is basically the Assassin's Creed game that everyone begged Ubisoft to make for a decade, but Sucker Punch actually went ahead and did it properly without loading it full of microtransactions and RPG bloat that nobody asked for. You play as Jin Sakai, one of the last samurai left on the island after the Mongols roll in and absolutely obliterate the local defense force, and the whole narrative centers around this internal conflict of sticking to your honorable samurai code or becoming a backstabbing ninja ghost to save your people. It is a classic Kurosawa film brought to life, and the story doesn't try to be overly complex with twists and turns. It just focuses on the tragedy of a man having to abandon his principles because he realizes that honor doesn't mean anything when your enemy is burning your home to the ground. The relationship between Jin and his uncle, Lord Shimura, is the emotional anchor here, constantly making you feel guilty for using stealth and poison even though you know damn well it is the only way you're going to win a war against an entire army. The combat is arguably the most satisfying swordplay ever put into an open-world game because it strikes this perfect balance between accessibility and depth without turning into a button-mashing fest. You have these 4 different stances that you switch between on the fly depending on whether you are fighting a guy with a shield, a spear, or a big brute. And once you get the rhythm down, it feels like a choreographed dance of death. It is incredibly lethal, meaning you can cut through enemies in a couple of strikes, but they can do the same to you, which keeps the tension high and makes every encounter feel dangerous rather than just a grind to whittle down health bars. The duel mechanics are a highlight, stripping away all the chaos of the battlefield to lock you into a one-on-one showdown that is all about timing and patience, zooming the camera in tight and letting the tension build before the steel clashes, and it makes you feel like an absolute badass every time you pull off a perfect parry. Visually, this game is a legitimate painting in motion, and the art direction does more heavy lifting than the actual graphical fidelity because they prioritize style over pure realism. The world is constantly moving, with wind blowing through fields of pampas grass, leaves falling from trees in ridiculous quantities, and storms brewing on the horizon, creating an atmosphere that is so thick you can practically breathe it. They made the genius decision to remove the mini-map entirely and use the wind to guide you to your objectives, which sounds like a gimmick, but actually keeps your eyes on the world instead of staring at a UI element in the corner of the screen. It encourages you to actually explore the island organically, following golden birds to hot springs or chasing foxes to shrines. And while some of the side activities can get a bit repetitive after the 30th time, the loop is so zen and the world is so pretty that you don't really mind doing it. The stealth is serviceable, essentially functioning as a lighter version of what you would find in other stealth action games, letting you grapple onto roofs and drop down on unsuspecting Mongols or terrify them with ghost weapons until they run away in fear. It fits the narrative theme of becoming a monster to fight monsters, and seeing the enemies react with genuine terror when you start slaughtering their friends adds a nice layer of immersion to the combat encounters. It is not reinventing the wheel when it comes to open world design, and you will recognize the structure of clearing out camps and liberating regions instantly, but the execution is so polished and the setting is so well realized that it elevates the standard formula into something that feels special. You are exploring this massive, towering monstrosity of a house that looks like it was designed by an architect who was actively having a stroke, with rooms stacked on top of each other in a way that defies physics and logic. The atmosphere is heavy right from the start because you are walking through a tomb where everything has been left exactly as it was when the person died, creating the sense of voyeurism that feels uncomfortable but necessary. You are climbing through secret passages and crawling into sealed bedrooms to find out how every single member of this cursed family met their end, and it is honestly one of the most creative ways to tell a story I have ever seen. The gameplay is a series of vignettes where you literally play through the final moments of these characters' lives, and instead of just being a cutscene, each death is its own unique minigame with different art styles and controls. 1 minute you're a little girl engaging in a hunger-induced hallucination where you play as a shark rolling down a hill, and the next you're a baby in a bathtub playing with toys while the water rises to a fatal level. It sounds morbid because it absolutely is, but the game presents it with this weird, whimsical tone that makes it feel like a dark fairy tale rather than a crime scene investigation. It creates this emotional whiplash where you are charmed by the visuals and the music, and then the game suddenly reminds you that you are watching a child die, and it leaves you feeling hollow in a way that most games can't pull off. It is a short experience, clocking in at maybe 2 hours if you're taking your time, but it doesn't overstay its welcome or pad the runtime with fetch quests just to hit a quota. It respects your time by delivering a tight, focused narrative about the inevitability of death and the stories we leave behind, and it doesn't try to offer some cheesy happy ending to make you feel better. It is just a raw, honest look at a family defined by tragedy, and it manages to be beautiful despite being incredibly depressing.
One summer, they evacuated the island, but Edie refused to go.
God of War Ragnarok is essentially Santa Monica Studio taking the foundation of the 2018 reboot and injecting it with steroids until it bursts at the seams with content. You are picking up right where the last one left off, but now Fimbulwinter is set in, meaning everything is covered in snow and ice, and the vibe is immediately more desperate and cold. Kratos is still the grumpy dad trying to keep his head down, but our boy, I mean Kratos' boy, is now a moody teenager who thinks he knows everything, which creates this friction that feels incredibly real to anyone who has ever dealt with a kid going through puberty while the apocalypse is happening outside. The narrative centers around the idea of fate and whether you are a prisoner to the prophecy written on the wall or if you can actually change your destiny by making different choices. It is a massive game that spans across all 9 realms, and each one feels distinct and dense, filled with lore that fleshes out the Norse pantheon in a way that makes the gods feel less like mythological figures and more like a dysfunctional crime family. The combat has been refined to the point where it feels almost rhythmic, taking the heavy, grounded impact of the Leviathan axe and mixing it with the chaotic speed of the Blades of Chaos right from the start. You have way more options for movement this time around, including a grapple mechanic that lets you zip up ledges and slam down on enemies, which adds a layer of verticality that the previous game was sorely missing. It is violent and crunchy, with every hit giving you this tactile feedback that makes you feel the weight of the weapon crashing into bone and armor. The enemy variety is significantly better this time, addressing the biggest complaint from the last game where you fought the same troll with a different color palette 5 times. You are fighting everything from small, annoying grim creatures to massive beasts that take up the entire screen, and the game forces you to actually use your entire toolkit rather than just mashing the light attack button until everything dies. The writing for the villains is where this game really separates itself from the pack, specifically with the portrayals of Odin and Thor. Odin isn't portrayed as this Zeus-like figure sitting on a throne throwing lightning bolts. He is written like a manipulative mob boss who talks his way into your head and makes you question everything you thought you knew. Thor is a depressed, alcoholic mess who is terrifying not just because he is strong, but because he is unstable and broken, which makes him a far more interesting antagonist than a generic doomsday villain. The game commits to the one continuous shot camera technique again, meaning there are no camera cuts from the moment you press start to the moment the credits roll, which is a technical achievement that keeps you locked into the perspective of the characters without any breaks for loading screens. It can be exhausting because the game is long and refuses to let you look away, but it creates a level of immersion that is hard to replicate. The pacing does stumble a bit in the middle sections where the game decides to slow down and force you into these lengthy walking and talking segments that feel like they go on for about an hour too long. However, these slower moments are usually used to build character relationships that pay off heavily in the finale, so it's a necessary evil to get to the good stuff. It's a story about letting go and trusting the people around you, wrapped in a package of extreme violence and high-budget spectacle. The visual fidelity is top tier, pushing the hardware to display particle effects and lighting that make the realms look like high fantasy concept art come to life. It's a sequel that understands exactly what made the first one good and doubles down on it. Firewatch basically starts with emotionally waterboarding you with a text intro that hits harder than a truck, forcing you to navigate through the wreckage of Henry's life before you even get to control the character. You play as this heavy-set middle-aged guy who decides that the best way to deal with his personal tragedy is to run away from society and live in a wooden tower in the Wyoming wilderness for an entire summer, which is a level of avoidance I think we can all respect. The game is technically a walking simulator, a genre that usually deserves to be thrown into a dumpster fire, but this one manages to bypass the boredom by giving you a walkie-talkie and a voice on the other end named Delilah, who essentially becomes your lifeline to sanity. The entire experience relies on the chemistry between these two people who never actually see each other, and the dialogue is so natural and reactive that you forget you are talking to a pre-recorded script and start feeling like you are actually building a relationship with this sarcastic woman in a lookout tower miles away. The visual style is absolutely gorgeous, stitching the obsession with hyper-realism for a stylized, saturated aesthetic that looks like a vintage national park poster came to life, and it makes walking through the woods feel genuinely peaceful until the game decides to make it terrifying. You are given a paper map and a compass, and the game refuses to hold your hand with a magical GPS line on the ground, so you actually have to look at landmarks and figure out where the hell you are going, which grounds you in the world in a way that most open-world games fail to do. The mechanics are incredibly simple, mostly involving hiking, rappelling down rocks, and reporting random things you find to Delilah, but the tactile nature of the interactions makes you feel like you are physically inhabiting the space rather than just floating through it as a camera. The atmosphere shifts from a cozy camping trip to a paranoid thriller so slowly that you don't even realize it is happening until you are standing in the middle of the woods at night, freaking out because you heard a twig snap. The game does an incredible job of making you feel isolated and vulnerable, playing on the fear that you are being watched by something or someone out in the trees. And because you are all alone, your brain starts filling in the blanks with the worst possible scenarios. You start finding weird things in the forest that don't add up, fenced-off areas that shouldn't be there, and equipment that looks suspicious, and the game effectively gaslights you into thinking there's some massive conspiracy happening around you. It captures that specific feeling of being alone in the dark where every shadow looks like a monster, and it uses that tension to drive the narrative forward without ever needing to give you a gun or a health bar. It is a story about escapism and the realization that you can't just run into the woods to solve your problems because your baggage has a funny way of finding you no matter how far you go. The pacing is deliberate, giving you days where nothing happens just so the days where shit hits the fan feel more impactful. It stands as a prime example of how to do environmental storytelling right, using the setting itself as a character that is indifferent to your existence.
Hey, that go okay?
It went fine.
Metro Exodus takes the claustrophobic nightmare of the previous two games and decides to drag it out into the fresh air, which somehow makes it even more terrifying because now you can see exactly how screwed the world really is. You are back as Artyom, the guy who refuses to speak a single word of dialogue despite everyone talking at him constantly, and you are leaving the Moscow tunnels to go on a cross-country road trip aboard a steam train called the Aurora. It is a massive shift in structure, moving from tight, linear corridors to these semi-open world sandbox levels that change with the seasons, giving you a sense of scale and progression that the series never really had before. The atmosphere is still thick enough to cut with a knife, but instead of just darkness and rats, you are dealing with radioactive swamps, deserts that look like a Mad Max Rejected set, and autumn forests that are deceptively pretty until a giant bear tries to rip your head off. The gameplay is built on a foundation of what people lovingly call Eurojank, where everything feels heavy, clunky, and deliberately slow to simulate the fact that you are wearing 50 pounds of scrap metal and carrying barely functional weapons. The gunplay isn't about snapping onto heads like you're playing Call of Duty, it is about praying your AK-47 doesn't jam in the middle of a firefight because you forgot to clean the mud off it at the last workbench. The weapon customization is actually one of the coolest systems in any shooter, allowing you to strip parts off guns you find in the field and slap them onto your own weapons on the fly using your backpack. You can turn a pistol into a sniper rifle or a shotgun into a 4-barrel death machine, depending on what the situation calls for, and it feels incredibly tactile and grounded. Survival is the name of the game here, and the game is constantly stressing you out with resource management that forces you to count every bullet and every second of air in your gas mask filters. You have to physically wipe the blood and rain off your mask visor to see, fix the cracks with tape when it gets damaged, and manually pump up the pressure on your pneumatic air rifle, which adds a layer of immersion that makes you feel like a scavenger rather than a super soldier. The enemies, both human and mutant, are lethal and aggressive, often forcing you to rely on stealth because getting into a prolonged gunfight is a great way to waste all your ammo and die in a ditch. The story focuses heavily on the crew of the Aurora and your wife Anna, who spends a lot of the game trying to convince you that there is a future outside the metro, and the downtime between missions is spent hanging out on the train, listening to them talk and play guitar. It creates a sense of camaraderie that makes you actually care about these people, which is crucial because the game has a hidden morality system that determines who lives and who dies based on your actions in the open world. It is a grim, unforgiving experience that demands your patience, but the payoff is one of the most immersive post-apocalyptic worlds ever built.
With us! Take him alive! Take this! Fuck off! Go to hell! Stay down!
Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy is basically the game that had absolutely no business being as good as it is, especially after the dumpster fire that was the Avengers game made everyone assume this would be another cash grab disaster. You are stepping into the jet boots of Star-Lord, and the developers made the smart decision to keep it strictly single player, meaning there is no live service bloat or grinding for loot boxes to unlock a slightly different shade of blue for your jacket. The narrative picks up with the team already established, but they are barely holding it together, constantly bickering and screwing up jobs, which captures the dysfunction of the comics way better than the movies ever did. The writing is the strongest part of the entire package, with dialogue that literally never stops. And while that sounds annoying, the banter is actually funny and helps flesh out the characters as broken people trying to find a purpose. The gameplay loop is a bit weird at first, because you are only directly controlling Star-Lord while shouting orders at the rest of the team like a glorified manager, but it clicks once you realize it is more about rhythm and crowd control than precise shooting. You are using your elemental blasters to freeze or shock enemies while commanding Gamora to slice things up, Drax to stagger big targets, Rocket to blow stuff up, and Groot to immobilize groups, creating this chaotic light show of particle effects that fills the screen. There's a mechanic called the huddle, where you literally pause the fight to give a motivational speech to your team, and if you pick the right dialogue option, you get a buff and an 80s pop hit starts blasting in the background, which is so incredibly stupid that it circles back around to being genius. The combat does get a bit repetitive by the end because the enemies turn into damaged sponges, but the spectacle of it keeps you engaged enough to push through. Exploration is strictly linear, which is a breath of fresh air in an industry obsessed with making every map 500 miles wide with nothing to do, so you are mostly walking down corridors and solving light environmental puzzles using your teammates' specific abilities. You might need Rocket to hack a door or Groot to build a bridge, and these moments are mostly just downtime to let the characters talk to each other, revealing their backstories and insecurities in a way that feels organic rather than forced exposition. Visually, the art direction is fantastic, creating alien worlds that actually look alien with weird flora and distinct color palettes that pop off the screen. The character designs took some heat initially for looking like off-brand versions of the movie actors, but the voice acting is so top tier that you stop comparing them pretty quickly and accept them as the definitive versions of these characters. It is a game that respects the source material without being a slave to the MCU, delivering a heartfelt story about grief and family that manages to be emotionally resonant while still letting you shoot space jellyfishes to the beat of Rick Astley. Star Wars The Fallen Order is basically one of the few Star Wars games that doesn't completely suck, which already makes it stand out because the history of Star Wars games is brutal. You had stuff like Knights of the Old Republic, which is legendary, but then you had 90% of the other shit that felt like cash grabs. Fallen Order actually tries to do its own thing. You play as Cal Kestis, this young Jedi who survived Order 66, the whole kill all the Jedi deal. The story isn't just, oh, bad guy, fight, fight, fight. It's about a dude who's dealing with trauma, guilt, and literally hiding from an empire that wants him dead. That's heavy for a Star Wars game, and the way it handles it isn't stupid or preachy. You see him evolve from this scared kid running from stormtroopers into someone who starts to take control of his life again. Gameplay-wise, it's kind of a weird hybrid. It's got that third-person action-adventure thing, but with Souls-like combat tension. You can't just spam lightsaber attacks. Blocking and parrying actually matter. If you get greedy, you die, and that's refreshing in a Star Wars game, because most of the time you just feel like a god swinging your saber at faceless enemies. They also mix in exploration with some Metroidvania-style backtracking. Different planets, hidden paths, little puzzles. Not just fetch quests or go from point A to point B, it actually makes revisiting areas feel worth it because you're unlocking secrets and force powers that make you feel like you've actually leveled up as a Jedi, not just in numbers. Zepho's ruins aren't just empty textures slapped together. They have verticality, hidden areas, and environmental storytelling. You can tell someone cared about making it feel like a real, lived-in world, even if it's small. And the combat integrates with exploration nicely. Force powers aren't just flashy. Force push can break walls, pull things down, or manipulate your environment in clever ways. Same with Force slow. It's not just an animation, it actually changes fights. The aesthetic and sound design are also not just Star Wars-y, they're Star Wars-y in a grounded way. Every saber swing has weight, every enemy has a presence, and the way the Empire is presented feels oppressive instead of cartoonish. It's not a massive open world, but the way they crafted a few tight, memorable planets with puzzles, fights, and narrative beats is smarter than a lot of bigger games that just throw open world at you without caring. And the combat pacing keeps you engaged without feeling grindy. 1 second you're climbing ruins, next you're in a tense duel, then you're sneaking past a patrol because you got cocky earlier. Some of the backtracking can feel tedious, and the story hits a few generic beats. But when it works, it really works. It's one of the few recent Star Wars games where you actually feel like a Jedi, where the story and gameplay click instead of being slapped together. It's smart, it's tight, and it doesn't insult your brain while telling a Star Wars story.
To come back. Still, there's got to be a stealthier way in.
Yakuza 0 is essentially a bipolar disorder simulator that constantly swings between a gritty, heartbreaking crime drama and the most absurd fever dream comedy sketches you have ever seen in your life. You're dropped into Japan in 1988, right in the middle of the economic bubble where people are waving taxis down with fistfuls of cash. And you play as two protagonists, Kiryu and Majima-chan, who are both caught into conspiracy over a tiny trash-filled plot of land called the Empty Lot. The main story is surprisingly grounded and serious, dealing with honor, betrayal, and the internal politics of the Yakuza clans. And the writing is so sharp that you will find yourself genuinely invested in the complex web of alliances and backstabbing. You watch these characters get beaten down, tortured, and humiliated, and the cutscenes are directed with this intense cinematic flair that makes every punch and every shouted line of dialogue feel incredibly heavy. Then you step out of the main story and suddenly you're teaching a dominatrix how to be meaner to her clients, or helping a timid boy buy a dirty magazine, and the tonal whiplash is so severe it should legally count as a concussion. This is the magic of the game because it refuses to take itself seriously the second the main plot pauses, allowing you to run a cabaret club, race toy cars in a surprisingly deep customization minigame, or just stand in a disco and dance like an absolute goofball. The side content isn't just filler, it is arguably the soul of the experience, fleshing out the world and showing you that behind the stone-faced killer exterior, these characters are just weirdos trying to survive in a city full of freaks. You can spend hours just managing real estate or training hostesses, and the game puts just as much effort into these mechanics as it does the actual combat, which is insane. Speaking of combat, the gameplay is a visceral, bone-crunching brawler that lets you switch between different fighting styles on the fly, transforming you from a slow, heavy hitter to a breakdancing whirl of death depending on the situation. Kiryu and Majima play completely differently, with Kiryu focusing on raw power and grabbing nearby objects like bicycles and motorcycles to smash over people's heads, while Majima uses a baseball bat and unpredictable movements to dismantle crowds. The heat actions are the highlight, which are these brutal, context-sensitive finishers where you might shove a guy's head into a microwave, slam a car door on his fingers, or pour a boiling kettle of water on his face. It is violently satisfying in a way that makes you cringe and laugh at the same time, because the sound design really sells the impact of every shattered bone. The open world of Kamurocho and Sotenbori is small compared to modern map marker festivals, but it is incredibly dense, packed with arcades, karaoke bars, and restaurants that you can actually enter. It feels lived in and claustrophobic, capturing the neon-soaked atmosphere of 80s nightlife perfectly. And because the map isn't massive, you actually learn the streets like a local. The currency system literally makes money fly out of enemies when you hit them, reinforcing the theme of excess and greed that defines the era. It is a game that is perfectly comfortable letting you cry over a tragic death in one scene, and then immediately cut to you singing a heartbreaking ballad in a karaoke bar while wearing a ridiculous outfit. It is a masterpiece of tone management that creates a world you just want to exist in, even if that world involves getting mugged by a guy in a diaper.
Yes.
Spec Ops: The Line masquerades as a generic bargain bin Call of Duty clone that you would find at a Walmart discount bin, but it is actually a psychological horror game disguised as a military shooter that actively hates you for playing it. You play as Captain Walker, a generic soldier man with a voice that sounds like he gargles gravel, sent to a version of Dubai that has been completely swallowed by sandstorms to check on a missing colonel named Conrad. But the game slowly twists that knife until you realize that you aren't the hero, and you are actually making everything significantly worse just by being there. It is a deconstruction of the entire genre that forces you to look at the digital violence you usually consume without thinking and confronts you with the reality of what you are doing. The gameplay itself is aggressively mediocre, which is usually a criticism, but here it almost feels like an intentional design choice to lull you into a false sense of security before the narrative pulls the rug out. You are doing the standard cover shooter routine of running from waist-high wall to waist-high wall, popping up to shoot guys in the head with weapons that feel functional but uninspired. The controls feel a bit clunky, and the movement has a heaviness to it that makes it feel like Walker is trudging through mud, or in this case, sand, which is the one unique mechanic where you can shoot out glass panes to bury enemies in an avalanche of silica. If you were judging this solely on the mechanics, it would be a forgettable 6 out of 10 experience that nobody would remember a week later, but the gunplay is just the delivery system for the trauma. However, the narrative is where this game grabs you by the throat because it is essentially a retelling of Heart of Darkness or Apocalypse Now set in a modern war zone where everything goes wrong. As you push deeper into the city, the situation deteriorates from a rescue mission into a chaotic free-for-all where you are fighting American soldiers, civilians, and your own sanity. The visual design of a buried Dubai is hauntingly beautiful, contrasting the opulence at gold-plated lobbies and luxury hotels with the gritty reality of corpses and sand dunes piling up in the hallways. It is a game that leaves you feeling dirty and hollow by the time the credits roll, successfully stripping away the glamour of the military shooter to show the ugly, traumatic reality underneath.
Man, I'm through with this shit.
Fuck you! At least I'm doing my job! You're the one who's fine, just sitting back, waiting for things to unfuck themselves!
Until Dawn is a horror game about a bunch of teenagers stranded on a mountain, and the first thing you realize is that these people are absolute idiots. That's kind of the point. You've got your jock, your nerd, the hot girl, the brooding loner, and the rest of the gang, all walking into trouble in ways that make you groan and laugh at the same time. The game is basically a playable slasher movie, and it leans hard into horror movie tropes, but it doesn't just throw you into cheap jump scares and hope you care. The trick it pulls off is making you actually care, which is wild because these are, on paper, completely generic characters. You watch them stumble around, make terrible decisions, freak out, and you're genuinely invested in whether they survive. Everything in the game feeds into that tension. The mountain lodge, the woods, the abandoned mines, they all feel like actual places that exist. You're not just wandering through hallways, you're walking through spaces that have history. There are notes, audio tapes, creepy environmental stuff that gives context to what's going on, and it rewards you for paying attention. It's not a huge world, but it's tight and layered. The way the game handles horror is smart too. It's not jump scare every 2 seconds, it's atmosphere, suspense, and knowing that one wrong step could get someone killed. And that's where the butterfly effect system comes in. Every choice matters. You save someone from falling off a ledge, you make a joke at the wrong moment, you leave someone alone to explore, and suddenly, later on, someone's dead and you're like, oh fuck, that's on me. It makes the story feel alive instead of just reading like a script. The characters feel real because of the motion capture and acting. You see them react to situations naturally. The panic, the frustration, the fear, it all comes through in a way that actually hits. The gameplay itself is simple but effective. Walking, looking around, making choices, quick time events when shit hits the fan, those QTEs actually matter. Fail one, someone dies. It's stressful in the best way. Combat isn't a thing here, it's all about tension, timing, and reading situations. Even the monsters aren't just there for scares, they're tied into the story and mythology of the place, so encounters feel meaningful instead of random. You can replay it and see completely different outcomes because of small choices, and every playthrough feels like you're watching a different horror movie unfold. It's chaotic, it's funny, it's scary, and it's oddly emotional if you actually get attached to the characters.
Listeners, an update on Hannah and Beth Washington, the twins who are still missing.
1 year ago tonight,
Road 96 is essentially a hitchhiking simulator that takes the concept of a procedurally generated road trip and mixes it with a political thriller, which sounds like a recipe for a disaster, but actually ends up being one of the most unique indie games out there. You are playing as a series of faceless teenagers trying to escape a fictional authoritarian country called Petria, which is run by a dictator named Tyrak, who looks and acts like every generic bad guy you have ever seen in a history book. The catch is that you don't just play one character, you play a succession of them. And if your character gets arrested, dies, or successfully escapes, you just start over as a new kid miles away and pick up the story where the last one left off. It creates this weird, disjointed narrative where the main character isn't you, but the road itself, and the people you meet along the way. The gameplay loop revolves around managing your stamina and money while trying to get to the border, and it forces you to make decisions that feel genuinely sketchy, like whether to sleep in a cardboard box to save cash, or pay for a motel room so you don't freeze to death. You are hitchhiking, stealing cars, walking, or taking the bus, and every mode of transport triggers different encounters with a cast of recurring oddballs who are all tangled up in this political mess. The survival mechanics are simple but effective enough to make you sweat, because if your energy bar hits 0, you pass out and get thrown in jail, ending that run instantly. It adds a layer of tension to the otherwise chill vibe of walking down a highway, making you weigh the risk of stealing food from a dumpster versus the risk of starving. The real meat of the game is the characters you bump into repeatedly, like a terrifying taxi driver named Jared, who is clearly a serial killer on the verge of snapping, or a clumsy bank robber duo who are essentially the comic relief of the apocalypse. The writing manages to balance the serious political themes with some truly goofy moments, like playing a trombone in a parade, or helping a kid fix a radio transmitter. And the game does a good job of making these interactions feel organic. The way the scenes are shuffled means your playthrough might be completely different from someone else's, although if you play long enough, you start to see the seams where the procedural generation just stitches pre-made scenarios together. The dialogue choices actually matter here, letting you lean towards voting for change, inciting a violent revolution, or just keeping your head down and running, and the game tracks the overall mood of the country based on what you say. Visually, it has that stylized, low-poly indie look that hides the lack of a massive budget, but the art direction is vibrant and colorful, making the landscapes of Petria fun to look at even when the textures are a bit muddy. The soundtrack is the absolute MVP of the experience, featuring a collection of mixtape-style tracks that range from synthwave to acoustic folk, perfectly capturing that feeling of being on the road with nowhere to go. It is a game that thrives on its atmosphere and its ability to make you feel like a small part of a much bigger event.
You'll never catch me. I'll run like the wind, fast and effortlessly.
L.A. Noire is arguably one of the most ambitious and confusing experiments Rockstar ever published, functioning less like a game and more like a high-budget interactive police procedural that somehow forgot to make the open world fun. You are dropped into 1947 Los Angeles, and the vibe is immaculate right from the jump, capturing that post-war atmosphere where everyone is smoking, wearing fedoras, and listening to jazz while hiding their crippling PTSD. The city itself looks incredible, recreating landmarks and streets with an obsessive level of detail that makes you feel like you stepped onto a movie set. But it is also completely dead, serving merely as a backdrop for you to drive from one crime scene to another without any of the chaotic sandbox freedom you expect from the studio. It is a game that demands you treat it with respect, forcing you to roleplay as a serious detective named Cole Phelps, who is possibly the stiffest, most socially awkward protagonist in gaming history. The big selling point here was the facial animation technology, which used some insane rig of 32 cameras to capture every single twitch and grimace of the actors, and the result is something that sits uncomfortably right in the middle of the uncanny valley. It looks impressive technically because you can see people swallowing or shifting their eyes when they lie, but it also leads to these hilarious moments where a suspect makes a face like they are actively crapping their pants just to signal that they are hiding something. The core gameplay loop revolves around these interrogations, where you have to look at these high-fidelity faces and decide if they are telling the truth, withholding info, or straight up lying. And this is where the game turns into an unintentional comedy. The doubt option, or bad cop in the remaster, is notorious because it turns Phelps from a calm, rational human being into a screaming psychopath in a split second, accusing a grieving widow of murder because she looked to the left slightly. Actual investigation work involves walking around crime scenes while ominous music plays, waiting for the controller to vibrate so you can pick up a cigarette butt or a lipstick case and rotate it in your hands like it is the Holy Grail. It is a slow, methodical process that filters out the people who just want to shoot things, because 90% of your time is spent reading ledgers and connecting dots in a notebook. When the action does happen, it feels heavy and clunky, with shooting mechanics that are serviceable but nowhere near the level of Max Payne or Red Dead, and car chases that feel like you're driving a boat through molasses. The driving physics are weirdly floaty, and while the period-accurate cars look gorgeous, they handle like absolute bricks, which makes the mandatory travel times feel like a chore. Despite the jank, the story is actually a fantastic noir thriller that dives deep into the corruption of the LAPD, the Black Dahlia murders, and the seedy underbelly of Hollywood. You start as a beat cop and work your way up the desks, from traffic to homicide into vice and arson, and each desk feels like a different season of a TV show with its own overarching plot and recurring villains. The narrative deconstructs the idea of the hero cop by showing that Phelps is a flawed, arrogant glory hound who creates just as many problems as he solves. It is a flawed masterpiece that nailed the aesthetic and the mood, leaving you with a tech demo that has a better script than most movies.
How about a scoop for the Examiner, Galloway? You could use some good press.
Another tramp, another message. Is the werewolf back in business, boys?
Do you have a mother, asshole? A sister? How about showing some respect for this poor woman?
Quantum Break is Remedy Entertainment basically looking at the medium of video games and deciding that it wasn't complicated enough, so they tried to forcefully weld a full-blown live-action TV show onto a third-person shooter, resulting in a project that is undeniably ambitious but also completely baffling in its execution. You are playing as Jack Joyce, who is just Sean Ashmore in a leather jacket, and after a science experiment goes wrong in a university lab that clearly failed every OSHA inspection in history, you get the ability to manipulate time while the rest of the world starts glitching out. The game operates on this weird rhythm where you play through a chapter of high-octane action, blowing things up and freezing people in time bubbles, and then the game literally grabs the controller out of your hands and forces you to sit down and watch a 20-minute episode of a live-action drama. The combat itself is actually some of the most satisfying shooter gameplay Remedy has ever cooked up, completely eclipsing the stiffness of Alan Wake because they finally let you play as a superhero rather than a scared writer with a flashlight. You aren't just taking cover behind waist-high concrete barriers like every other generic shooter from that era. You are actively encouraged to play aggressively by zipping across the room in a blur and flanking enemies before they even realize you moved. The time powers feel incredibly punchy, specifically the ability to cast a time bubble around an enemy and then empty an entire magazine of assault rifle ammo into it, stacking the bullets in the air so that when the bubble collapses, the guy just instantly vaporizes from the concentrated impact. The particle effects during these fights are absolutely insane, with the world fracturing into these sharp, geometric glass shards and ripples. that make it look like your graphics card is having a meltdown, but it fits the narrative theme of time breaking down so perfectly that you don't even mind the visual noise. The story is a confusing knot of time travel paradoxes and corporate conspiracies, but it manages to hold itself together better than most sci-fi stories because it commits hard to the rule that you cannot change the past, only ensure that it happens the way it was always supposed to. It is a game that swings for the fences and misses the ball on a few huge design choices, specifically the massive file size and the streaming issues with the show, but you have to respect the hustle for trying something that nobody else was crazy enough to attempt. It stands as a unique, flawed experiment that is definitely worth playing once just to experience the sheer spectacle of a time-fractured world. Final Fantasy VII Remake is basically Square Enix looking at the first 5 hours of a 20-year-old game and deciding to stretch it into a full 40-hour RPG, which sounds like a blatant cash grab on paper, but somehow manages to be one of the most satisfying action games ever made, despite some baffling design choices. You are stepping back into the boots of Cloud Strife, who is an emotionally stunted eco-terrorist mercenary with a sword the size of a surfboard, and the game does an incredible job of making Midgar feel like a real, suffocating industrial dystopia rather than just a series of pre-rendered backgrounds. The production value is through the roof, with cutscenes that transition seamlessly into gameplay and character models that look better than most CGI movies. The combat system is the real star of the show here, managing to do the impossible by blending the old-school turn-based menu management with modern hack-and-slash action without it feeling like a chaotic mess. You can't just mash the attack button and expect to win because the enemies will absolutely rinse you. You have to actually build up your ATB gauge to use items or spells, forcing you to be tactical while dodging lasers and giant robots. Switching between characters feels fluid and necessary, with Tifa being a rapid-fire brawler who can stagger enemies in seconds, while Barret acts as a tank who can shoot pesky flying enemies out of the sky. The boss fights are spectacles that feel like MMO raids, with multiple phases and cinematic interruptions that make you feel like you are fighting for your life, even if the camera sometimes gets stuck behind a wall and blinds you at the worst possible moment. The story takes some massive liberties with the source material, introducing these Dementor-looking ghosts called the Whispers that physically intervene whenever the plot tries to deviate from the original game, which is a meta-commentary on fan expectations that is either genius or incredibly stupid depending on who you ask. It turns the narrative from a straight remake into a weird sequel-reboot hybrid that keeps you guessing, and the character writing is surprisingly strong, fleshing out side characters like Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, who were basically throwaway NPCs in the original. Cloud's development from an edgy, too-cool-for-school jerk to a guy who actually cares about his friends is handled well, and the voice acting sells the emotional beats perfectly. It is a flawed, bloated, but undeniably fun experience that proves you can teach an old dog new tricks, provided you have a billion-dollar budget and a killer soundtrack that slaps harder than it has any right to.
What's going on?
Talking about GTA 4, and let's not bullshit this. This game isn't flashy with bright colors or over-the-top chaos like GTA 5. It's grimy, depressing, and somehow still addictive as hell. You play as Niko Bellic, this Eastern European guy who comes to Liberty City to chase the American dream, which, spoiler alert, is mostly scams, shady people, and getting fucked over constantly. The story isn't kill a bunch of random people, it's about betrayal, revenge, and the consequences of trying to survive in a city that doesn't give a shit about you. Liberty City itself is a massive part of why this game works. It's not just a sandbox for chaos, it's alive. Streets are filled with pedestrians who actually react to you in different ways, the traffic feels like a nightmare you'd experience if you actually lived in a city, and every neighborhood has its own vibe. The gameplay leans into realism compared to other GTA titles. The driving physics are heavier, cars actually feel like they have weight, and shooting isn't a button-mashing carnival. Cover matters, aiming matters, and combat can feel tense instead of just chaotic fun. And then there's the whole side stuff. Bowling, darts, going out to bars with girlfriends, even just walking around and talking to people. It's small, stupid shit, but it adds a layer of immersion that makes you care about Liberty City as a place, not just a playground. The story is grounded in a way most open-world games fail at. Nico's past haunts him, the people he meets have layers, and betrayal isn't some dramatic twist that comes out of nowhere. It feels earned. You feel the weight of consequences, and that's rare in a game that also lets you blow up cars and shoot people in the middle of the street. And the tone of the whole thing is dark and cynical without being cartoonish. Liberty City feels hopeless sometimes, which is the point. It's a city that chews people up and spits them out. Technically, it's got flaws, physics can glitch, NPC AI is inconsistent, and some missions are brutally annoying. But everything that works beautifully. The storytelling, the world building, the immersion, it's all crafted so that you actually believe you're following someone struggling to survive while still doing incredibly illegal shit. GTA 4 isn't about being flashy or fun for the sake of it, it's about being honest with its world and characters while still letting you cause chaos when you want to.
What's in it for me? I'll give you what you after. Cold, hard cash. That what you chasing, right? Amongst other things.